So I'm going to actually introduce next a good friend of mine, Alex Kuntz. Him and I, we actually went to school together. And I remember the day that I first heard him speak about Movember. It was a pretty emotional day, actually, just to see a friend of mine who had been through so much, and so much of it, you know, I actually wasn't aware of. Some of these things in terms of men's health can be pretty tough to talk about, as I kind of mentioned before. And then that day that Alex kind of shared his story with me, and actually with a bunch of students, kind of like what we're doing today, it really spoke volumes about, you know, the type of person he is, but how important what we're doing here is as well. So if everybody just wants to welcome Alex.
Okay, awesome. A kind introduction, so thank you, man. It's an honor to be here because these are topics that are near and dear to my heart, and so thank you for having me. So here's the deal. About 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health concern each and every year, and this could take form through depression, anxiety, mood, body image, personality disorders, psychosis, and so on. But we also know that about 1 in 10 Canadian men will experience an episode of major depression in their lifetime. And this is concerning because, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, depression is a medical condition that, when left unaddressed, it can have serious consequences. And this is one of the areas that Movember is working actively to address. Because, as Jesse mentioned, about 75% of deaths by suicide are those of men. And every minute, somewhere in the world, a man takes his life by suicide. And 8 of these men, each and every day, are from Canada here alone. So, you know, why is this happening, and what are some of the obstacles that are going to get in the way, that are getting in the way to address this? Well, you know, I don't think anyone's going to argue. There's a stigma associated with mental health. You know, it's not talked about the same way that other forms of health are, and I don't think it has to be this way. This is not a new phenomenon. If we look back in time, stigma has always been associated with medical conditions, whether it was the plague back in the day, or even take cancer, for example. Just 50 years ago, if someone in your family was diagnosed with cancer, you know, this was not the kind of thing that was being talked about openly. And so I think it's only a matter of time before we can turn this around. But secondly, there also appears to be a reluctance to seek help. And I knew this to be true for myself. And I'm not sure if this is a product of the stigma associated with mental health, or, you know, perhaps especially being men. I mean, it's not exactly manly or macho to admit that not everything's not okay and it's not going well. And so I think these are some of the issues that Movember is positioned beautifully to address. And so those are the issues, but it's not all bad. The good news is these challenges have been identified and are now being addressed by this movement that we're gathered here today about, Movember. And so the idea here is to use the undeniable presence of the mustache to stimulate conversation and bolster awareness about some of the challenges that men face. And if you can't grow a mustache, that's besides the point. This is my personal selection of mo here, and there's tons of options out there to get involved. So I want to switch gears here and tell you a little bit about my story with depression. But before I do, I want to emphasize that my intention here is not to proclaim any fundamental truths about the nature of this condition or how to fix it necessarily, because the bottom line is that every experience of depression is unique, and I have admiration for all paths of healing. But I want to share some details, you know, about my experience, because, you know, if you or someone you're close to experiences something similar, know that you're not alone with this, and there's always hope. So I began working with depression about 6 years ago now, in the second year of university for me. And For me, depression manifested through diminished passion and motivation and desire to pursue aspects of my life that had usually once excited and inspired me. And there's a TED Talk by a man named Andrew Solomon who said, the antithesis of depression is not happiness, but rather that of vitality. Right? And so I think overall, my experience with depression can be summed up by just a lack of interest in life itself. I mean, I continued to show up to school and sports and parties, and I wasn't hitting snooze on the alarm, but you see, none of these actions were fueled out of genuine interest or passion. For me, it was out of fear. It was fear of failing. That this feeling that I wasn't good enough, and that I was going to have to outwardly demonstrate this to myself and others to see. And so I subconsciously responded with busyness and trying to soothe an inner sense of lack or void with a sense of accomplishment and productivity. And inevitably running myself into the ground and allowing my close relationships and overall well-being to take a hit in the process. I had heard of depression and known of depression at this time, but I thought, well, like, this couldn't be the case for me. I mean, surely this was different, right? Like, I was outgoing, I did well in school, I played sports, I ate well, I supported friends and family, etc. And I mean, disease in general is something that someone somewhere else gets, right? You never think that would happen to you. But it soon became overwhelmingly apparent that something had shifted, and I wasn't living my life in a sustainable fashion. And I was really struggling. But you see, I didn't say anything right away, like a lot of young men. And it wasn't until about 2 years later that when my girlfriend and I, we split, and when this ended, all of a sudden now it felt appropriate to say something. Almost I had an excuse to be feeling the way I was feeling. And so after suffering for about 2 years in silence, I finally spoke up and I sought help. And upon acknowledging these struggles, I learned that I had indeed been experiencing symptoms of depression, and that this was a well-documented medical condition that affects millions of people. And it wasn't some unique evolutionary defect that was like totally exclusive and unique to me that I had to be keeping quiet about. And so from there, as treatment, I began talk therapy or counseling. And this was a little bit uncomfortable for me at first. But I thought, I haven't been averse to treating any other kind of medical condition in the past, like stitches for a laceration or antibiotics for an infection. So, how is this any different? And so talk therapy involves, working through or identifying unserving thought patterns which inevitably give rise to feelings and eventually action. And this work was invaluable for me. There's a psychiatrist and author, and actually a faculty member here at the University of Toronto, Norman Deutsch, who's talked about how a skilled psychotherapist can literally be a microsurgeon of the mind by shedding light on areas of one's consciousness that aren't readily accessible to that individual on their own. Right? And there's this adage in neuroscience that where neurons fire together, they wire together, right? And so this kind of work done repeatedly over time can literally yield structural and functional changes to the brain and then subsequent mind activity, challenging this notion that mental illness is like this cold, hard life sentence that can only be treated with drugs or shockwaves or surgery. And so this work was brilliant for me, and helping me identify, the negativity bias that we have in our brains that have helped us evolve as a species, but can often give rise to a distorted lens in which we're viewing the world. And so for me, the vantage point of another was crucial in helping me realize this, because as the Canadian author Eckhart Tolle has said, you can't think your way out of a prison made of thoughts, right? And so that's where this kind of work was paramount for me. But then the summer after my undergrad degree, I sustained a fairly severe concussion playing rugby. And this one sidelined me from like all aspects of life as I had known it for close to half a year. And so I was experiencing intense headaches and dizziness and nausea, brain fog, incredibly restless and worried mind. And so I was unable to exercise to balance my mood. I had to defer my master's as I wasn't fit to be in school at the time. Even socializing was a real challenge in this state. And so all of this really exacerbated the depression that I was experiencing. But now, for the first time, I wasn't able to band-aid the situation with my habitual response to adversity, which was just to, dig deeper and work harder, figure it out myself, get tougher. I get these messages that are often casted to men in society because I was unable to do that. And so this was really challenging for me. But a few months later, when I was well enough, I found yoga. And I started practicing yoga. And I had practiced yoga before, but only to become more flexible or more injury resistant. But I soon realized that the practice was so much more than that for me. I think it's been the single-handedly most effective modality for alleviating some of the post-concussive symptoms that I've experienced. Because while the mechanisms aren't totally understood yet, there's this saying in Zen that goes, the best way to control a wild cow is to give it a wide pasture. Right? And so I think what's going on in yoga, every time I go to the mat, it's this safe space without all of the specific aims and expectations, free of the incessant external stressors. And it's an opportunity to evoke this relaxation response, as Herbert Benson and his team from Harvard has coined, this simple but potent modality for taming an overdriven sympathetic nervous system and tapping into the intuitive healing abilities of the body-mind. And so, and I think at the heart of yoga is this idea of the process of adopting a compassionate, non-judgmental attitude toward oneself and the experience, right? And this is what mindfulness is. These practices that are time-tested, rooted in Buddhist tradition, but have recently been adopted for secular use in medicine in form of mindfulness-based stress reduction, as coined by John Kabat-Zinn and his team. And so, and in this work, it's, we're redefining the relationship with experience, and as emerging evidence would suggest, rewiring the brain and the nervous system. And so this work has really helped me with some of the challenging depressive and post-concussive symptoms. And ultimately, just for navigating life, as it is, without all the judgments and labels, which is especially helpful when, our plans for ourselves don't align with those of the universe. And so, to conclude, depression has been a wonderful teacher for me. It's allowed me to wake up to what's true and real in this life, and it's taught me numerous lessons that I simply wouldn't have learned otherwise. And I can honestly say that I'm living my life in a far more open and genuine manner as a result. And so, my vision for Movember here is to empower men and women, although they seem to be a lot farther ahead in this realm, to take an interest in cultivating health and well-being, right? And most importantly, when things aren't going well, having the courage to reach out and say something. Because our work here is not to manufacture this perfect cookie-cutter human experience for ourselves, but rather have the courage to open to it as it is, triumphs, struggles, and all, right? And I think, as healthcare providers and those aspiring, we need to lead by example here, right? And so this needs to come from the bottom up on the individual level. And so how are we going to do that? Well, I'm not going to stand up here and pretend like I've got it all figured out, but generally speaking, the recipe for good health, though not always easy to employ, is fairly simple, right? So chat with one another about what you're going through, move the body, take time out to quiet the mind, consume good ingredients, and generally connect with one another, maybe whatever it is, because we're all in this together. So lastly, you know, have some fun with this, right? These are heavy topics, but I think like anything, best if it's approached in a playful manner. So that's it for me. And if anyone has any questions or would like to reach out, please don't hesitate. Thanks, guys.